Do you know how many years it's been since Aston Villa are in the Champions League? 41 long years. And this is the story of one of Europe's most storied clubs, telling how Villa reached the pinnacle of European glory. Yes, they won it all, but then drastically plummeted into relegation, near bankruptcy. And now we get to celebrate their long-awaited joyous climb back. This episode of European Night is sponsored by our great friends at New Balance, a brand that I truly adore. Incredible brand behind the boot, giving players total control of the ball and the game. The Tekela touch perfected.
And he's done it! Villa have won the European Cup!
That was the sound of your 1982, well, what's now known as the Champions League final. Back then it was called the European Cup. Simpler days. Didn't even have an anthem. But it was an English team winning it for the sixth time in a row. Aston Villa victory on their first try after 5 years of Liverpool and yes, Nottingham Forest dominance. A 1-0 win in 1982 over Bayern Munich in the Stadion Feyenoord, also known as De Kuip, which means, I think in English, the tub, which makes me love it even more, in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. And a victory won despite losing their starting goalkeeper, the quite iconic Jimmy Rimmer, after just 9 minutes to a ripped neck. Yes, that's not an injury that you hear about a lot nowadays. Oh, I think it's Rick, son. The painkillers didn't do the trick, so Jimmy had to exit, and in his place, raw, untested, 23-year-old Nigel Spink came on for only his second appearance of any kind in a final, and he proceeded to show a nerveless performance, pulling off a career-defining majestic series of clutch saves to lay the base for a narrow yet iconic win. Villa's 67th minute winner coming off, well, half off bearded burly Scouse wonder striker Peter With's shin and half off his ankle. The game, it was so different back in 1982. Only the actual league champions qualified for the European Cup. Think about that idea. It was all such a lot purer, less bloated, much less commercial. And it took this is incredible, 8 games to win the whole bloody thing. That year, Aston Villa entered the season with coaching staff of just 4 people. There was a manager, a coach, a scout, and a physio. Again, purer, simpler times. Midway through the season, February 1982, the title-winning manager Ron Saunders resigned over a contract dispute. So the club promoted the scout Tony Barton to manager and just kept rolling. No GPS, no Optadata analyst, certainly no nutritionist. For one game against Dynamo Kiev that was moved to Yalta in Crimea due to icy weather, the team had to bring their own food, 150 steaks, 12 dozen eggs, 112 pounds of potatoes, proper fuel. That's how you won on Europe's biggest stage, and the players paraded the trophy around. Rory, we'd barely recognise the game they were playing back then as football, but the European Cup established Aston Villa as one of the most historic clubs in England at that time.
Growing up in the 80s, it was the fact that Villa could call themselves European champions, a team that had been champion of Europe, separated them from certain other teams. So maybe someone like Spurs, say, it was what marked Villa out as a member of the true elite, that they are one of the English clubs that had been champion of Europe. And you have to remember that Villa were one of the founding members of the Football League. They have always been a huge club. Birmingham is a massive city, massive industrial city, and Villa have always been its leading light. But they actually hadn't won a title since 1910, when they won it in 1981. That is a long, long time for a really big club not to win a league. So they were, I think, seen by a lot of people as maybe not a sleeping giant, but a faded giant. And when they won the First Division and then won the European Cup back to back, it reasserted them as a true giant, as one of England's greatest clubs, in a way that maybe would have started to dwindle just a little bit had the success not come at that stage. And it's probably not insignificant that a few years later, when England's elite teams started talking about maybe breaking away from the Football League, reorganising domestic football, a lot of it was led by what we would now call the Big Six, but I think back then was called the Gang of Six. And they were the giants of the English game, which were Arsenal and Tottenham, Liverpool and Everton, Manchester United, and Aston Villa. And that was because Villa kept that company. They were seen as really, maybe not royalty, but certainly one of football's great aristocrats. And at the centre of that was that European Cup. The trophy that they won with a basically largely homegrown side, with a squad of 14 players, with 7 players who I think played in every game in the league winning campaign. On the back of their achievements, Villa kind of became a modern power again.
But so much has changed. Within 5 years, Aston Villa were relegated. And honestly, since then, they've spent time bouncing between solid mid-table outcomes and the second tier. From 2006 to 2016, they're actually owned by another American, Randy Lerner, also once the Cleveland Browns owner, and he found out just how hard it was to crack the top of the table despite having the team's logo tattooed proudly onto his ankle. I wonder if he's had it lasered off since he sold the team. But under Lerner, they finished 6th place 3 times in a row. But I think he talked about how there was a ceiling and he didn't have the finances to get them any further. The team bottomed out. Relegation saw them sold to Chinese businessman Tony Shah. Things got worse, much worse. Shah's funds were frozen because of legal troubles. The club couldn't even pay its $5 million tax bill. They were reportedly days away from bankruptcy. Agreed a cut price deal to sell then young talisman Jack Grealish to Tottenham, which would have been an alternative kind of history. And that's when the current ownership of V Sports swooped in. August 2019. Fronted in part by American billionaire mountain climber, skier, Milwaukee Bucks co-owner and horse jumper Wes Edens. Rory, since the heights of the early 80s, what's Aston Villa's place been in British football's landscape? This for me is a massive club, a traditional club, who had the chance to really own a massive city of Birmingham, but really hasn't had much to show for it for at least 40 odd years.
Yeah, I think during the 90s they were considered one of the Premier League's sort of, maybe not top-rate powers. That was Manchester United and Arsenal, but they were in the rank below. Villa regularly sort of made it to cup finals or competed in semi-finals. They were in Europe occasionally. They would have every few years they'd have something that looked a bit like a title challenge. In the 2000s, I think once Roman Abramovich arrived at Chelsea, football got away from Aston Villa a little bit. And although they were relatively early in terms of being taken over by an American owner, they did, as Randy Lerner himself would later admit, kind of get the sort of American owner who couldn't quite catapult them into the stratosphere. There was a future for them in being the 6th or 7th biggest club in England, but that's a dangerous position to be in, because the temptation for fans, for ownership, is to chase being the 5th biggest club in England, the 4th biggest club in England, and that is incrementally more and more expensive. And it caught up with Villa, and it's strange that they're back in the Champions League, really, because it doesn't feel too long since they were just re-establishing themselves as a core member of the Premier League after relegation. They came back 5 years ago, and they had the first couple of seasons were slightly nip and tuck, as they always were in terms of survival. But under Wes Edens and his ownership consortium, they've invested really heavily. They sold well. They obviously sold Grealish for £100 million to Manchester City, and they have built a really competitive team. And I think, although maybe nobody in the kind of the Birmingham area who's not a Villa fan would admit it, it does feel as though the Premier League's a better place for having Aston Villa in it.
It is such a weird and wonderful thing. Birmingham is an enormous city, an enormous industrial beating heart of Britain, a city that's had true economic challenges. But you think of Liverpool, known around the world because of football and music. Manchester, known around the world because of football and Oasis, and known around the world because of football and music. Birmingham ultimately should be a massive footballing muscle too, but all of the teams, Aston Villa, West Brom, Birmingham City, and more, have all failed to really have a foothold as a true threat until Villa returned to sharpened form.
Yeah, well, if you think about the history of it, if you take it over the long term, like Villa were one of the founding fathers of the Football League. As I say, they are probably the most traditional club in England in that sense. And then you had the great Wolves teams in the 1950s. Again, Wolves not far from Birmingham in the West Midlands. It was the beating heart of English football for quite a long time. And I suppose that Birmingham got a little bit left behind as a footballing location. Not in terms of producing talent. Birmingham's always produced talent, but Manchester United rose, Liverpool rose, Everton rose. Eventually, Man City would come along too. The financial might of the game kind of shifted to London, and Birmingham was kind of trapped between these two twin powerhouses in the northwest of England and in London, where they obviously economically the clubs there have massive advantages. And I think it's been difficult for all of those clubs to figure out their place in kind of the modern soccer landscape, really. Wolves now are a consistent Premier League team. Bit of a bad start this season, but they've been in there for a long time. West Brom kind of bounce up and down. They've had problems with ownership. Birmingham City, now owned by Tom Brady, but they've had real problems with ownership as well. Villa are the ones who've ridden it best, but all those teams have had real difficulty, and I don't think that's coincidental. I think it's to do with, to an extent, with where they are and where football and how football's landscape has changed around them. But Villa now seem to have all the things in place to compete as a modern force as well, rather than as a historic sort of traditional one. They've got owners with deep pockets. They've got owners who are keen to shape the league to their own interest. They've voted with Manchester City on quite a lot of their City's pet subjects at the Premier League board level. They've got a squad that has a lot of star quality about it. They've got an amazing stadium. The Holt End, where the hardcore home fans sit, I think is the best single stand in English football. It's a wonderful ground designed by Archibald Leach, who was who's probably the most influential football ground designer in history. It's a real kind of cathedral of football. It rises up from a neighbourhood in the way that all the great English grounds traditionally do, and they have the one thing that's really transformed them. They've got an elite manager. That's the thing that's turned Villa from something that was once great into something that might be great again.
You mentioned elite managers. We should get into this because, yes, 41 years after their triumph, Aston Villa are back in the Champions League. Yes, they sold Jack Grealish to Manchester City for $130 million. They've just kept investing and growing. And for a manager, it's been remarkable to watch. They turn to the quite suave, sophisticated chip on his shoulder, though. Unai Emery, former Arsenal boss, who was run out of the Emirates with a stain of failure that he feels was unjust. Man has won 4 Europa Leagues with Spanish clubs, the French Ligue 1 with PSG. Then to run the backroom operations, in came quite favourite of this pod, a man we've gone deep on before, Monchi, who just sounds like one of your most favourite avant-garde artists. But he's a man nicknamed El Lobo de Sevilla, the Wolf of Seville, a self-taught gent who has reread The Art of War multiple times. That's all you need to do to become an elite recruitment front office gent in football. He helped invent the role of the modern sporting director in Sevilla, where he seemed to never miss on bargain bin transfers, and gem after gem, sold them on for fortunes, won more Europa Leagues than I can count. Rory, we've talked a lot about how stratified the game is now. You won't get a team winning 8 games on the bounce and overcoming a vastly superior Bayern Munich to win the Champions League anymore. But with this trajectory, with these gents, again, Unai Emery and Monchi together in Birmingham it's quite surreal. Peaky Blinders fans, how can a club like Aston Villa establish itself amongst the top clubs in Europe again? Can they cement this position?
Well, by doing what they're doing. I think what's really interesting about Monchi at Villa is that he's not actually been as active as he normally is. If you look at what he did at Sevilla, there was an awful lot of volume with Monchi. In good years, and it worked brilliantly, and in bad years, where he'd kind of trade his way out of trouble. He's not. When he arrived at Aston Villa, that was my one sort of query about how good an appointment he might be. And this is as someone who has met Monchi and likes Monchi very much and admires the work he did at Sevilla. I didn't have a lot of qualms, but my one reservation was Monchi likes buying players. Like there tends to be a lot of churn with Monchi. But at Villa, he's been relatively restrained. They've obviously spotted certain opportunities. Pau Torres came in central defence. I think they moved really smartly for Yuri Tielemans. They have reinforced the squad as and when they need to, but they haven't done huge amounts of business since Monchi arrived, and I think that's quite telling. It's been much more judicious. It's been very much picking their moments, picking their places, picking their targets. And then you have Emery, who was always an elite manager. I think probably wasn't the right person at the right place at the right time when he was at Arsenal. But he took a squad that that was underperforming under Steven Gerrard, his predecessor, and he's turned them into a really slick, really smart unit who can compete with the elite in England. And it's probably a bit of a stretch to say that they might be title contenders in the next 2 or 3 years. I don't think they will be. I don't actually think that's Villa's traditional role, really, to be honest. But there is no reason, if Monchi and Emery keep doing what they're doing, to think that Villa will disappear or fall away, or that this might all have been some sort of mirage or illusion or whatever. They will stick around at the top end of the Premier League, in the top 6 or 7, for the foreseeable future. And because of the way that football's changed, not from 1982, but from when Villa were sort of trying to get into the Champions League under Randy Lerner in sort of 2005, 2006, 5th place in the Premier League quite often might be good enough for a place in the Champions League. They obviously finished 4th last season. There's no reason to believe they can't do that again this season. They are the match of Chelsea. They have the resources, they've got the structure, they've got the manager, and they've got the players. They're here for the long haul, I think, Villa.
We'll see just how far Unai Emery can take Aston Villa in their first Champions League campaign in over 4 decades. But Villa fans, especially you, Tom Hanks, enjoy every moment of it, because you know better than anyone, in football, nothing's ever guaranteed.